but I'm really excited to present you this work, and I will give some disclaimers because I know some of you are information system scholars. Um, I'm not going to go there. It's about sustainability, and there is some academic content. I do draw on the literature, but what I'm trying to do here is basically show you a preview of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is very much a work in progress, but I'm working on a book that will be published by a trade publisher on decarbonization of energy and industry. It's going to be more readable and exciting than that title sounds. In fact, that's not the real title. It is my effort to basically take all of this academic work and interest that I've had since way before sustainability related change was cool, since way before you were allowed to say that word in a business school, and kind of put it together with what I see going on in the world right now. And as Maha said, I've spent a long career working on sustainability issues, and I kind of got to the point where I thought, the business case, explaining why companies aren't doing it fast enough, should do it, shouldn't do it, might do it. It's still important, but I literally was sitting next to someone 3 years ago on an aircraft who was going to take sun from Namibia and ship it to the German chemical industry. And that was what awoke me to the fact that decarbonization is happening. There are technology developments and all sorts of innovative and interesting things going on all around the world. Many people don't know about them. And what I'm going to talk about today is really what we do know might be misleading. And so, as the title says, it's about managing expectations on the road to decarbonization. So bear with me. I'm going to make it slightly interactive because I'm in presenter mode. I can only see a subset of you, so feel free to come off mute, chime in, raise your hand, whatnot. We'll try to make this as interactive as possible. So I do have a question for you to pose at the outset here. And then as we go, feel free to jump in and ask questions. So basically expect something that's a mix between light academic content and examples and a message that I hope to share with a broader group. And so your feedback is extremely timely and important because I'm literally trying to work on writing this out as we go. And so tell me, you don't get it, or the structure is all wrong, or we need more of this or less of that. So put yourself in the shoes of your favorite colleague, friend who has nothing to do with academia and might be vaguely interested in saving the planet. And let's see if this might make any sense to that person and to you. So without further ado, I'm really going to talk about this very simple statement a lot, and just to get us on the same page. This comes from the sociologist of expectations, so there is a sociology on that, which is good to know. I've been reading some in that area, and an expectation is simply a statement about the future. And when it comes to sustainability, decarbonization, net zero, we are constantly making statements about the future, trying to project what might happen, what we want to happen, what ought to happen, and therefore we're setting expectations. And that's a wonderful thing because we don't want the planet that we have right now. We don't want the planet that we're going to have if we don't change significantly the actions that are producing climate change and all sorts of other ill effects, both environmentally and socially. And yet, does anyone know what the future will really look like? And even on this topic and many others, we can think back to 5 years ago. Could we have predicted today? What would be the conversations? What would be the technologies? What would be the things that would be deemed normal and preferable versus not? Even a year ago, we would have had probably even a harder time predicting what we're now facing. So by definition, we don't know the future, and yet we must lean into it and continue to generate and believe in certain expectations. So really what I want to do is sort of three things. Level set on what expectations are and why they matter for decarbonization, not just technologies, but approaches. But I will talk specifically about technologies because I think that's an area and I would love to hear more about digital technologies, but certainly material technologies and changes and innovation and transitions are absolutely at the heart of how we decarbonize energy and industry. So we'll talk specifically about expectations to do with technology development, the power of expectations and how they continue to fool us, and how we might better manage expectations to accelerate decarbonization. So without further ado, sorry, just getting my mouse in the right place. This is my interactive question. I'm going to talk to you about three technologies and ask you just which one would you feel as an investor, as someone who would put money towards it, is the most viable or promising. Okay, so we have the European-based electric vehicle battery gigafactory. It's going to roll enough EV batteries off the line for 1 million electric vehicles. So that's option one. Option number two, imagine a modern airship. So the Hindenburg exploded, but don't worry, this one won't. And it can take off and land from regular airports. So it's sort of a hybrid mix between an airship that just floats up and down and something that actually takes off and lands, can move cargo, it can move people. And it initially has a 75% lower carbon footprint per unit carried. So that's option two. And option number three is a small village in a remote part of the world that does not have electricity, could have an electricity grid, village size, that is fed by limitless renewable energy from underground, and it's not geothermal, but I'll talk to you more about what it is. Okay, so I don't know how to do the best show of hands. Are people putting this in the chat?
I'm a quick question.
You're only seeing the title slide.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very weird. Okay, well, I wonder if because I can see the slides that I'm on, so I have no idea. Maybe I should stop sharing and come back into sharing, because it's going to be very useful if you can see what I'm seeing. Thank you, and sorry about that. Okay, let's just go back in. Tell me what you're seeing now.
Now we see a slide with a title, but no content as yet.
Okay, good. Okay, then now do you see the content coming? Yes? Oh, yay. Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you for alerting me to that. Okay, so I just explained these to you. Perhaps the best thing to do is in the chat, just literally put one word: battery, airship, or renewable electricity, and I will see how we're voting. And I might do that thing that happens in teaching where I'm going to ask someone to share why they made a particular choice, but let's see how we go. Okay. What is the time frame? Thank you, Ivanka. 3 years. Within the next 3 years, you want this to be viable or becoming viable. Renewable. Lots of people going for renewable energy for the village. Okay. Depends what you want to know about scalability. We can think of scale different ways. I'll give you another 20 seconds to add in anything else. Any other responses here? I think, Daniel, we've got you. You're on airship. No one else has voted for airship. Has everyone got their response in? Okay. Okay. Daniel, can I pick on you and say, why the airship? What makes it interesting to you?
Well, I guess, answering more in my hope, what I would wish to make it work rather than what would be most viable. So maybe I misinterpreted and I just projected my wishes for what I'm most worried about.
Okay. You're most worried about aviation then, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, this is very helpful to me. And you'll see in a moment, your hopes and dreams matter. And so many people said the renewable electricity for the village. Can someone come off mute and explain why you made that selection? There's no wrong answers, by the way.
I mean,
okay.
35% of carbon emissions are energy related, and it has, if you say remote village, I assume it has social side effects as well, because it helps that village to develop, improve the livelihoods of the people there. So it
Yeah.
has ripple-on effects, I would hope for. I'm a bit curious about this underground magic energy popping up, and if it's not geothermal, I'm curious to see what it is.
We'll find out. We'll find out. You and many others. So, okay, great. So, I'm assuming that other folks who said renewable energy for the village, yeah, I mean, it's providing electricity to people who don't have it yet in a way that seems both socially and environmentally sustainable. Okay. And we have Ivanka, EV battery. This, I think this is your comment, is the only scalable to a meaningful level within 3 years. Do you want to come off mute and explain why you're voting for EV batteries? Or Veronica or anyone else who's Alexander?
Sure.
Why the EV batteries? Yes.
Sure. So it's about the time frame, right? So at least I don't know any current renewable energy source that can be scaled to a meaningful level within 3 years. European batteries can, and so EV battery gigafactory can. I mean, we have seen attempts to do so. Long-term viability, given the material scarcity, as well as the extent to which they would pollute and introduce secondary biodiversity, challenges, is a whole other matter, right? So,
Yeah.
so there the trade-offs move further on in the future. So that's why I was, and I don't know anything about modern airships, so that's the only reason why I haven't voted.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. If none of you have read, it's a fiction novel. It's very large. It's called Ministry for the Future. And if you're interested in learning about the dream of airships, it's there. But I'll show you later on. You don't need to read a novel to learn more about airships. Okay, this is wonderful. And there's there's answers I'm going to show you in a moment. There's no wrong answer here, because I think what I use this to illustrate is simply that we're not very good at predicting the future around technologies necessarily, but that's okay, right? We never have been. And what I appreciate you doing is noticing that there are complementarities, interdependencies between environmental and social impact, for example, and also there are trade-offs, right? So Ivanka's point about no matter what we do, what's the yardstick that we're measuring this through? Is it scalability? Is it just a kind of quote carbon lens, or are we caring about other impacts on the environment? So these are, I can tell you've done your homework. These are all great questions. The reason I'm illustrating these is because they sort of do show us several patterns around ways in which our expectations sort of mismatch, quote, reality. So what happened? Well, the EV gigafactory in question, which is Northvolt based in northern Sweden, is currently bankrupt. And so, it was a great idea. We'll go into each of these cases later on, but you haven't got your money back yet if you invested in them. The modern airship is in development. It has flown. I will show you pictures later on. We don't know whether it will take off literally and how viable it will be. It will not unseat, me flying from London to Canada, for example, at least definitely not in the immediate future, but it could be a solution for some forms of aviation. The limitless renewable energy from underground has been operational. I believe it is currently stalled, but it did supply electricity to a village in Mali for over a decade. The source of the renewable energy is natural hydrogen, which happened to be beneath the ground, beneath this village, but it also happens to be beneath the ground, beneath many, many other parts of the world. We don't know whether this is, quote, scalable in a classic way that we think about scaling technologies, but we do know that natural hydrogen lies beneath the ground, and I'll tell you more about that. And it was discovered by accident in the 1980s in this particular village, and then a Canadian company, it turned out, went over and figured out how to tap it. Very small scale, but the chief of the village was able to watch television for the first time, watch football on television. So everyone was happy, and the rest of the village got lighting and electricity. So it can surprise us sometimes, right? Any surprises? Were you surprised by these sort of, quote, realities in these technologies? Yes, Daniel, are you? Yeah, Ivanka too. Daniel, are you feeling a bit better about dreaming?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
I was surprised about the factory that it didn't work out. Yes.
Yeah, well, for now it hasn't worked out, but many times bankruptcy is a phase. But we'll talk more about each of these cases as we go. What I do want to do is just sort of level set a little bit. Sorry, my mouse is getting annoying here. On why we care about expectations being a statement of the future. What's the big deal? I think these examples show that frequently our expectations mismatch reality. And I use that not to fool you, but just to say it's really hard to predict, right? And if we look backwards, who would have known how certain things come out? So I use the Northvolt Gigafactory, electric vehicle Gigafactory, to illustrate this pattern of height, where essentially for our purposes, we can think our expectations are getting way ahead of reality. And I use reality in air quotes. I'll explain why in a moment. Conversely, we have sort of caution or conservatism, which isn't a great word. Hype is much more well known, but expectations getting behind reality, right? And I want to be clear that that's not about low expectations. I think we can really believe in some of these things. We just don't necessarily hear them, know about them, and share information about them in a way that people will understand them and their potential. So we can have over and under expectations, and then we can have what I call surprise, where we just don't know, right? None of you knew that this source was hydrogen. None of you knew that in the 1980s they discovered this source that was tappable below this village, and yet some people do. So this is important because when we have expectations about decarbonization technologies, and particularly when they're wrong, which they often are, or inaccurate, we can waste money, we can overinvest, we can also waste money on the wrong things, we can underinvest. And that's really important to recognize. The other thing about expectations is they're really sticky. So while technologies can change and go up and down, and investment levels can go up and down, our minds associate certain things with the past. So how many of you have heard of hydrogen vehicles, single passenger vehicles with on hydrogen? Yeah, okay, cool. I can't see everyone's hand. Sorry, I wish I had a huge screen, but I'm on my little laptop. And come off mute if you want to weigh in on this. Do we think hydrogen single passenger vehicles are viable today? Big shaking of head from Tobias, big thumbs down. Ivanka?
Honda has been trying for many, many years. And I mean, I think sorry, not Honda, it's Toyota and a bunch of
Toyota
consortium in Japan. I'm not familiar with any kind of scalable solutions. It's not looking likely.
So
the
Toyota
entire
has
energy
sold,
balance is is compared to a battery electric vehicle.
Yeah.
If you go from source to well,
Yeah.
the overall efficiency is just lower with a hydrogen a single vehicle with
Yeah.
hydrogen engine. It's just not efficient compared to other alternatives.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Anyone else? We know a lot about hydrogen vehicles here, which is great. So, Toyota is the only holdout still, and they offer a hydrogen vehicle. And I have seen one in the course of my research in the UK. They've sold 30,000 units, and they've had the program going for over 2 decades. So I'm not a car manufacturer, but you want to sell more than 30,000 units. And yet we have hydrogen buses, we have potentially hydrogen heavy goods vehicles. And so the fundamental technology that you would run a vehicle using hydrogen and not batteries anymore is not considered crazy. But most experts that I've spoken to, and you guys count as experts as well, believe that the hydrogen single passenger vehicle is a thing of the past. And yet, my point about accumulating and persistent expectations over time is now anytime you mention hydrogen, people get all upset about hype and overhype and believe hydrogen can't do anything because they remember the early 2000s when we were all told the line about hydrogen single passenger vehicles. In fact, in the early 2000s, every major car manufacturer, not just Toyota, and every oil and gas company had a program on hydrogen. The US government under George W. Bush, who is not exactly known for his environmental sustainability credentials, had actually put a huge amount of money into hydrogen programs to support the coming, quote, hydrogen economy, which was entirely around passenger vehicles. And, you know, we might not remember those times, but there was also a second technology vying, which was also ridiculously expensive and very unclear that it would work. And that was called battery electric vehicles. We now know, with the hindsight of 20 years, which one won, but it wasn't obvious at the time. To the point where when George W. Bush stood up at his 2003 State of the Union address, one of the statements he made, thank you, that Hyundai does as well. I'll keep track of that, Tobias. One of the statements that George W. Bush made in 2003 at his State of the Union address was, if you have a child born today, it is likely, or it is possible, that the first vehicle they drive could be a hydrogen-powered vehicle. So there was real investment and commitment at that point, and yet now we sort of poo-poo it, right? So the entire hydrogen industry or hydrogen economy, if there is one, is still operating or coming out of that shadow. I'm amazed by how many people I speak about, and they just instantly go to single passenger vehicles when you say hydrogen, even though there are many other ways to manage that technology. I do happen to have a child born in 2003, and I can guarantee you, for the reasons you've sold, she'll never touch a hydrogen-powered vehicle. And she does have a driver's license, which is a bit unusual for some in that cohort. So anyway, all we need to know is that expectations can long outlive the underlying shifts in what the technologies actually accomplish and in what we're actually trying to do with the technologies. So even if we have over and under investment in the short term, someone goes bankrupt, this happens all the time, no biggie. It's the persistent expectations, especially in areas of decarbonization, which are hard enough for the public to understand anyway, that can also get in the way. And then finally, obvious point, we need the highest probability for impact out of any of the technologies and approaches we adopt today. So we won't get it right. We will get it wrong a lot, but we need to tune our expectations so that we have the best opportunity for betting on the right ones, as it were. To be clear, and expectations are not just hopes or visions, but Daniel's vision about or dream about the airship is well placed, right? On the one hand, we want to dream. On the other hand, we want to create. And so expectations actually, quote, do something, to quote the sociologist of expectations, because they create the future. And we are academics, so we recognize this, but also just, you just need to read the headlines. Pick up 3 newspapers, they'll have 7 articles about whether we're in an AI bubble or not, or maybe that was only 2 weeks ago when I did these slides originally. But we know from stock markets, we know from run on the banks, that it doesn't need to have any material underlying truthiness to it, although the global financial crisis definitely had material underlying truthiness around people's homes, mortgages, etc. But expectations can create really important futures, and then we can be surprised by our own expectations. They are particularly powerful for technology development when there is some underlying material challenge, right? And many of you, your comments have already indicated that you get the fact that with decarbonization technology, we're dealing with things that have to be made and remade and reconnected. So many of you might know this man with his nice little badge. It kind of gives it away if you can zoom in on his badge. Picture taken in the 1970s, and the man has a law named after him. Let me just check in the chat if somebody's named him yet. Okay, thank you, Maha. I would love to get that question in a second, because I don't know this vision research. So let's, this man is Gordon Moore, by the way. So have we heard of Moore's Law? Moore's Law is the reason why our laptops and now our iPhones are constantly going obsolete. Because Gordon Moore, back in the 60s, he was a semiconductor, early on in the semiconductor industry. He later became the either CEO or president of Intel, but he was first with Fairchild Semiconductor, who literally invented semiconductors, computer chips. And he was the one who looked backwards in time and said, oh gosh, hey, it looks like in about a year, the number of transistors on a chip has doubled. And that might not sound like anything, but basically what that means is the chip gets faster and more powerful. In fact, it doubles in speed and capacity. And he looked backward at first and said it was about a year. And then he said, well, maybe 18 to 24 months. And that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It became known as Moore's Law. And I did my dissertation research at Intel in 1998, and literally everyone everyone working on every new manufacturing process, every piece of the puzzle was completely oriented to reproducing Moore's law over time. And they literally, that was their yardstick. And the entire industry had roadmaps that operated to this yardstick of reproducing Moore's law. So even when it's very difficult, technically, even when it involves manufacturing technology and physical manipulation, they, even back then, they kept saying, we're reaching the physical limits of Moore's law. We cannot possibly shrink transistors anymore. And through dogged determination, they have continued to this day. So anyway, expectations are not just is the AI in a bubble or not. They can have material technologies associated with them. We're going to get to your question next, Maha. But they also create futures in a way that are somewhat unpredictable. So the image on the left is meant to be fiber optic cable. Those of us old enough to know about it know that there was another bubble, the dot-com bubble, and this led to a huge amount of money being lost in speculation around companies that had ideas but not really products, and it led to, many decades later, infrastructure that we're still benefiting from. So while some of the people who were building the backbone for all of this dot-com activity, and some of them, like Norchild Networks, went bankrupt themselves as a result, there was hype around how much fiber optic cable we'd need, and that energy was like no other. So in the near term, it was a bit of a bubble. In the long term, it led to fundamental shifts in infrastructure. And we can start to ask the same questions on the right-hand side is an image of a data center. And anyone who's been alive on the planet in the last year knows that we're all stressed about energy now because we have so many data centers that we're building. They have such excessive loads that they're demanding. If they're on grid, this is a huge problem. There's affordability questions. There's simply just getting the power questions. And maybe this will be one of those legacies where 10 years from now, people say, wasn't it the moment when we all started caring about data centers, not climate change per se, that actually led to an acceleration in, for example, alternatives, renewables or off-grid solutions? I'm not putting money on that, but those are the conversations that are going on. So again, when it comes to material technologies, expectations become even more interesting because they can have these material legacies that persist, and that may surprise us. Maha, your question, I'd love to just make this a bit more conversational. So vision, I don't know the literature on organization visions by Swanson and Ramiller. Can you share?
Just briefly, I mean, I'm just trying to recollect enough thoughts about that. But the paper is seminal. It's an Org-Sci paper. I forget the year now. But the whole idea and the premise of that is fairly similar to what you're saying about expectations. That, I mean, the story behind that is that new ideas, when they emerge, people often think, especially if they come from the business world, that sometimes they can be full of hype, just sort of the terminology that you're using, but don't disregard hype. This is what they both suggest in that paper, that hype actually performs a function because hype creates realities. And so the idea that these business employees often go to different conferences and have conversations, sharing ideas, when they do bring them back into their own organizations, often those things start to materialize, sometimes not in exactly the same way, but they shape reality. So sorry, that's just a quick summary of
that's fantastic. I've written that down, and I really appreciate that because I need to anchor, even though the audience doesn't care about the literature, I care deeply about anchoring this in what we know, and that very much resonates. So let me keep going because I think it really feeds into this thing about what is the power of expectations, and we need them. We're never going to not have them, yet they fool us, and yet they're really important and useful. So thank you for that. So again, from the literature in general, expectations are regarded as powerful because they connect things, and in the most obvious way, they connect present and future, and to some degree past. But the first thing they connect is our understanding, or what I earlier on said, quote reality, right? If our expectations get ahead of reality, what I really meant was get ahead of the fundamental value of the underlying technology, which in itself is unknown. Going back to Intel and the semiconductor chips, that could have meant nothing, right? Like, I don't care how many transistors you can squeeze on a chip unless that power of computing actually has value in our society or in our economy. So even when there is a materialization of these things, we sort of don't really know what the fundamental value is. And yet our expectation is a very simplified representation of what that value could be. And then, as we've seen, the expectation then feeds the construction of that quote reality. So a few things they connect: past, present, and future. So they connect temporally, they connect people, they connect different groups. So we have experts who profess about the viability or not of hydrogen vehicles. That gets into the media, and then the general public has a sense of expectation around that. They also connect folks who have more skin in the game, as it were. So the inventors, the investors, and the policymakers who need to ideally be working in a way that brings something to reality or not. And then they also connect spatially in the sense that we can be inspired by a solution. For example, in a village in Mali, that's where the hydrogen was found. And that might signify that there are other ways for us to develop that in other ways. But of course, they connect imperfectly. And the other beautiful thing that we'll see in a moment is expectations are also vague, right? And those of us who have studied, strategic ambiguity or know some of these terms know that both of those things are actually really powerful together. So they make connections, but the connections are not fully specified because A, they can't be, and B, that gives us some flexibility. Of course, connections can constrain. So here's where I'm just going to bring back the Northvolt example. And again, it's an illustration. I've met the CEO. I literally ran into him at the top of a large timber building in the town of Skellefteå, which is in northern Sweden. Skellefteå is located strategically on a port, but also more strategically on one of the very powerful rivers that provide hydropower to Sweden for a lot of industry. And Northvolt was envisioned, it started as a company in 2016, 2017. It declared bankruptcy a few months after I met. I was not intending to be there to study Northvolt. I was studying green steel in a few towns over. But nonetheless was introduced to him in September a year ago, and they filed for bankruptcy a few months after that. So I was convinced. I'd read all about Northvolt in the Financial Times. It was an amazing story. Why would you not want to have a, quote, homegrown European mega factory? And indeed, people had really believed in it. So they had attracted between 14 and 15 billion euros of investment. People like Goldman Sachs were backing them, but also some of this was EU funding and EU grants. They had also, like anyone, sort of with an image of a kind of Silicon Valley startup behind them, and I'll say more on that in a moment. They had already signed up key customers. They had committed orders from the likes of BMW, from Volkswagen, mostly in Volkswagen's case, I believe, for their trucks division. And they had this very charismatic Swedish CEO who had been an executive at Tesla. So the man knew how to build batteries, right? He comes back to Sweden, and you've got amazing renewable resources. You've got a commitment to be the greenest battery factory. You've got key European customers signing up. You think, especially circa 2016 and 2017, you might beat China on some of this stuff, not necessarily on price, but on made in the EU. And they went one further. They said, not only are we building this huge battery factory, we're going to build a site adjacent to it that recycles the batteries. So they would have a full end-to-end circular solution. To Ivanka's point, they had actually thought ahead about the fact that we're not just trying to do green through the lens of climate, and also because they're in Europe, they wanted to do green more holistically. They had also, in the community, very small community, they were very concerned about, getting the right skilled labor. They did it in a way that involved a lot of rapidly built temporary buildings initially, but then they were starting as a community to think about how do we house all of the talent that we need to bring in from around the world. They were only partway along that when they went bankrupt. Before they went bankrupt, though, a couple of key things happened. They promised certain outputs on their factory, and by 2023, it was leaked that they were only at 0.1% of their anticipated output. So they were clearly having scale-up difficulties. This is not surprising in the world of batteries, because batteries are chemistry, and chemistry is hard. And even if you've made batteries in the US with Tesla, you can't necessarily make batteries in northern Sweden. There are a number of other issues. It turns out when you're building a battery factory, you need to buy all your equipment from folks who sell you that equipment, and they tend to be either Chinese or Korean manufacturers. So there were some challenges in terms of literally speaking the language and working with getting their production facilities online. There's various conspiracy theories out there on the internet and elsewhere. There were sadly some deaths. So there was some concern over how safe and how well managed this facility was. Nonetheless, they struggled to basically get the factory up and running. And here's where hype constrains. You would think, okay, that's fine, go back, reset with the investors. No, they were very much informed by how Silicon Valley does things. So when they started to see the challenges mount, time had moved on, right? In the world of technology, batteries change. Their customers were also saying, well, hold on, what about that new kind of, the battery world is a bit of an alphabet soup, isn't it? And I don't understand battery technology fully. But in the time that they were committing to making batteries in this first factory, there were new batteries coming online. Customers were potentially interested. Oh, is this one cheaper? Is it, are we trading off cost versus power? Let's explore that. So BMW, Volkswagen didn't necessarily have a long period of time to wait for this battery factory to come up. So Northvolt responded by saying, well, right, we're going to acquire some other battery factories and we're going to open some new ones. And meantime, the IRA came along incenting companies to operate in the US. No more. That's expiring. But they and everyone else said, well, let's go. In the end, they went to Canada. They ended up in this short period of time having expanded from committing to the one factory in northern Sweden to actually either operating or acquiring intending to operate, 5 different battery factories on 5 different continents. So hype can feed the sort of extreme grappling to make something work, rather than feeding, in this case, what might have been more productive for them, a slowing down or opening up of other possibilities for them so that they could gain more time to A, address their manufacturing problems, and B, work with their key customers. A few months before I visited last September, BMW canceled a significant order, and that was the beginning of the end. So again, if your hype is built on what we call the social what's the not value, but you can either have material proof. You can either have material proof. We've got batteries rolling off the line, or you can have social proof. We've got Goldman Sachs, we've got BMW standing by us. We're going to be great. When that social proof starts to erode, then the whole thing can start to collapse. So I'm not stating it very well. Sorry, it is a bit early, but long story short is hype both creates this opportunity based on generating the input and the investment and the excitement, but it also creates the very constraints because you're trying to deliver on those, and you might go to extremes in this case. This is what Daniel Logan and Matthew Grimes define hype as, and I think it's really important. Maha, I'm interested in the stuff on organizational vision. So I think if it's not clear now, one of the things I'm trying to grapple with is organizations, individuals, and quote, society at large. We all generate and perpetuate expectations around technologies, and how does that influence and scope organizational action, and what role do organizations and others have in being accountable to these expectations, right? And so that's something I'll raise later. So there's nothing in that definition that says hype is good or bad. It's just when it traps you that it can be bad. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, expectations are also powerful because they are vague. So we don't actually know, right? And temporally, we don't know the future. So our expectation is always a sort of preceding statement about it. And in terms of communities, again, I said, we connect communities, we connect people at different levels of knowledge and expertise. By definition, those who are deeply understanding, for example, battery manufacturing, have a very deep and wide fundamental value, understanding of the fundamental value of the technology. The rest of us just have the headline, right? Expectation. And so this is where again, it's a good feature that expectations by definition simplify complexity, but it's also a bad feature when we expect, ta-da, someone will wave a magic wand and I'll drive my electric vehicle off the battery line. Any questions or comments so far? Confusions? I realize I've spoken for 45 minutes, or we've spoken for 45 minutes already, so I want to make sure we have time for conversation. Okay, I'll keep going. I'll try to accelerate a little bit. Here is the Airlander. This is the airship I mentioned earlier. So, expectations can also exaggerate these gaps and constraints. So what we believe is possible and what has been made possible, we might not make those connections. This is a real image from The Guardian newspaper in the UK, taken of the Airlander airship. And you can see it doesn't look like the Hindenburg per se, but there are some key similarities. It's a large blimp. It's a double elliptical blimp. So if you look at it from the back, it's got kind of cheeks, which led the UK press to call it the flying bum when it flew. This is in Bedfordshire, which is about an hour from Cambridge. And the CEO of this company, Hybrid Air Vehicles is the name of the company. Airlander is the name of the vehicle, is a former EMBA student of ours. And he showed up in class and I learned about his company, and I've been fascinated ever since. So did we know about this? Anyone know about Airlander? Daniel thought it was a dream and a vision, but the thing has flown. Now, that is the original craft. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. It was actually originally developed 2008, 2009, I believe, in the 2000s. It was commissioned by the US Department of Defense for use in surveillance. The war in Afghanistan ended, and so they didn't use it. But it has test flown. They proved that they could fly this. Why would you use it for surveillance? It can fly low and slow, and it can take off and land anywhere. Why is my colleague reinvesting in sort of generating the Airlander as a commercial solution? And actually, I just read on their website the other day they have signed up some more defense contracts. Basically, they argue it can carry people. So if you look at the little cabin underneath, floor to ceiling windows, I've used the VR headset that shows me I could be floating above the Antarctic. Very Ministry of the Future, that novel I told you about, that's literally their image. So luxury air travel, at least getting it into people's imaginations, but also very realistically moving cargo in and out of places that don't actually have developed airstrips. So it can land on an airstrip, it can land in a field, it can land on water. So, short hops moving things from Northern Africa to Europe that might be fresh vegetables or whatnot, where you're not going from airport to airport, but you're going on the Airlander. You don't need to be going at jet speed, and you don't need to be going at jet altitude. And so low and slow is what this craft does. They've signed a number of contracts for commercial passenger travel between islands. So the Scottish Islands up north, some islands in the Mediterranean. So folks who are currently flying conventional aircraft there are happy with being able to connect customers, because you're not going to care if it takes you a few minutes longer to do a short hop between islands. But like I said, you're not going to go to Singapore on this from Europe. Okay, so it does exist, and there's even further proof. They had to deflate the whole craft because it was actually literally in the warehouse in Bedfordshire for a long time, and as you can imagine, it wasn't aging that well. They are redesigning it, reconfiguring it, but that is the original rotor engine and me standing in front of it. And I embarrassingly called it the teeny tiny rotor, but because when you look at the image of the whole craft, you see this teeny tiny little rotor on the end there, but it's an enormous craft. And by the way, they have plans to make this even bigger and scale it. And they are relying on, and I use them, sort of virtual reality goggles, that's not me, to help us understand what this could look like. But by and large, most people I've spoken with think this is still science fiction. They think if they think of airships and they've read Ministry of the Future, they think that it's a thing that might happen in 100 years. Or what else do they think of? The Hindenburg. So the Hindenburg was a major disaster. At that time, airships were a completely normal way of traveling across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, with the Hindenburg, it was filled with hydrogen, which is highly explosive. That's the stuff of rocket fuel. So a little spark makes hydrogen explode. The Airlander and other modern craft are filled with helium, which is not explosive. So it's still lighter than air. You still get the rotor for controllability and takeoff and landing, but it is completely different from the Hindenburg. However, one of the challenges, as I said, expectations die hard. In the case of the hydrogen electric vehicles, they die even harder because most of the population has an image in their head of 100 plus years ago when the Hindenburg exploded and would probably not voluntarily get on nor even back the Airlander. And yet, this may be a technology that we see. Sorry. Okay, so and then finally, just a little bit more about the village. So it says Burakabugu, and if anyone comes from Mali and can help me pronounce that, I would greatly appreciate it. As I mentioned, it was the 1980s. They were building, they were drilling for water. They wanted to tap water to supply the village. And they took a break because they were going deeper and deeper, and it was really slow and boring, and there was no water. And they kept trying to find water, no water, no water. So on the break, a construction worker lit a cigarette. And I just told you what happens when hydrogen meets flame. He was fine, but there was a small explosion. In fact, there was an ongoing flame because stuff emanating from this borehole that was otherwise dry just kept burning and burning, and it literally burned for weeks. So we're in the middle of Mali, and there's a flare of hydrogen going up in the 1980s. And finally, the Canadian company said, well, why don't we see if we can capture that and control it and tap it? And so they did. And it took them some time to build the infrastructure, but it was really fairly simple because if you can burn something, you can turn a generator. And if you can turn a generator, you can produce electricity. So that is an image of them with their controlled hydrogen now in the tank, feeding into, I think it was an old Ford motor. And unfortunately now, after operating for more than a dozen years, I think a part of the generator has broken. And so they, last I checked, were currently unoperable. Meanwhile, there is an article, and you can read all about it in Nature magazine, because the entity that was tapping this particular well thought, well, if there's hydrogen down there, there might be hydrogen elsewhere in the region. And so these show all of the places where they drilled, and they found incredibly pure, up to 99% pure hydrogen reserves laying underneath the ground all around this particular village. Now, does that mean we have renewable energy forever? Does it mean you're going to tap it and turn it into electricity? We don't know, but hydrogen is very useful for a number of things. And having a natural resource is very interesting. And when I say it's renewable, sometimes people get confused because what else do we pump out from underneath the ground? Of course, we pump out oil and gas, and we deplete it, right? That's the whole challenge. It's not a renewable resource. Hydrogen, it turns out, is continuously generated in the Earth's crust. Most of it escapes because hydrogen is 14 times lighter than air and the smallest molecule, so it's wily, it makes its way out. But the right kind of trapping structures, which actually have been found all over the globe, in Russia, in Australia, in Canada, can hold reserves of hydrogen. And trust me, I've spoken to the geologist on that. So whether it's pure enough, whether it's exploitable, is to be known. But if we could, it would be quite interesting. And the fact that the Earth's crust keeps generating it, it's as simple as having the right kind of rock and water in contact with each other. And so not a solution to necessarily scale and offer everywhere, but certainly a very interesting technology. But the reason I use this one is because it shows us that we didn't even think it was possible. I have been face to face with a German chemist who was telling me all about fusion and refused to believe that it was possible to find hydrogen underneath the ground. and I've spoken to all of the geologists who've found it, written their PhDs on it in the 80s, extensive academic literature on it, and yet experts still believe that it's even possible for this to be materially there. And that obviously leads to potential skepticism and underinvestment. Okay, I got to move along. So thank you for the airship thing. I'm going to save the chat when we're done, but any other examples that you know about? As you can tell, I love my stories. So we've seen this statement a million times before. And I guess I just want to turn in closing to a couple of thoughts about, now that we know that we get fooled in certain patterned ways by expectations, how do we think about doing it, quote, differently for decarbonizing energy and industry? I don't have the final answer, but I think some things are worth paying attention to. The first is just to notice another reality about expectations is, on the same question, we don't have the same expectation. And this U-curve graph is just trying to show us conceptually that those who experience or understand the highest levels of uncertainty about the future value of a technology are either very close in terms of their expertise, so they know how you make batteries, or they know how hard it is to tap hydrogen, or what have you. And therefore, they know all the technical and other feasibility related reasons why this is difficult, right? So they're depicted on the left-hand side of this U-curve. If you're very distant from the technology, the general public, you have no clue, you may also have very high degree of uncertainty about technology, like airships. I don't know, who knows? I mean, I don't know, I read about it once, right? It's the folks in the middle. And what I'm arguing is it's the folks in the middle are the investors, the policymakers, the business people who are trying to exploit the technology and the development. They might have the lowest expectations about the uncertainty around the technology, i.e., they're more confident in it, right? And this is both the good and the bad of hype. You want those people to believe in it, but also in believing in it, those people at the bottom of the U, if you will, are the ones who need to be most accountable for what actually happens. And if you think about Moore's Law was a statement about what we're going to do, but it was also an accountability to deliver on it. And I think in the area of decarbonization technologies, we need to be very, very critical and careful in thinking about what do we promise and what happens as a result, and who's accountable for delivering that when we're thinking about possibilities. And Nidar, I remind you, in most of these areas, it's not just private investment, right? So that's what makes it so complicated. Private investors can go big or go home. VC funding exists entirely to, put money towards a bunch of things, expecting most of them will fail. But as long as you have one home run, again, both the time we have to solve this problem, the amount of resources that need to be put into it, and the idea that in most areas, we're going to need some public commitments, at least in the way of regulation or tax incentives or credits, alongside private investments. When I say we need to think very carefully about what accountability looks like, I don't have any magic answer, but those people who want to invest, who want to believe in it and want to support it, need to be helped in some ways to figure out what it looks like to have an actual pathway to performance. So that's just saying we need to also expect accountability. And then I just have a few things that I want to close with which actually is going to be chapter 4 in my book. So they're less well thought out, but they're there. So how do we overcome these challenges that expectations pose to us? One of them is we just get, I'm an engineer by training originally. We get really boring and we look at life cycle assessments and we start looking across value chains and across stakeholder expertise, because actually all of the things I told you about, they're not surprises and they're not disappointments and they're not whatever to certain communities, to certain people, right? The geologist knew the natural hydrogen was there all along. And anyone who's been involved in making battery factories knows that it's really, really hard to scale these things up. So how do we, rather than be misled by the headline or jump on a bandwagon, how do we actually get realistic about What do we know by looking across different stakeholder expertise, but also importantly, how big is the problem that we're solving, and is this really where we should be putting our attention and expectations? Back to the aviation world, when I sat down with Hybrid Air Vehicles and their senior team, they said, you know, it's so frustrating because there's a bunch of money flowing into aviation startups. In fact, billions and billions of investment, the great majority of private investment into aviation startups. Can you guess where it's going? Is it going into airships? Is it going into, it's kind of going into low carbon solutions, but what sector of the market is it going into? Air taxis. Have we heard of the air taxi? Basically, you know, electric helicopters. I've seen these at the aviation shows, you know, fancy schmancy things, very high end, you know, basically think how to get the rich person from the airport to downtown in any major urban center. So we're putting billions of dollars into investment into that segment of the market, which, as you can well imagine, represents a teeny, yet sadly probably growing proportion of the impact of aviation, right? This is not anything to do with regional flying, short haul flying, long haul flying, any commercial flying in any way. It's the taxi. And so is that, if we're thinking about what the problem is and the nature of the problem, is that actually really where the hype should be? Is that really where the investment should be? Sadly, I'm not sure how we can turn that around, but if you actually do the math and look at the slices of the industry and the impact, you're not going to invest there. But people are investing there. The other thing we need to do is look ahead in time, right? Because I think a lot of the expectations we have right now about whether something is going to win or be viable are by definition about with today's lenses on. What happens in a world where renewable energy is so abundant, where we've built out at such scale solar, wind, geothermal, or hydro, depending on what you've got, and we have to overbuild it, we know, because of peak demand and storage and all of that kind of stuff. What happens in a world where electrons are priced at zero or negatively priced? Then it's a whole game changer in terms of how you might think of certain forms of storage, in terms of like electrolysis of green hydrogen, which, trust me, I've been to enough of the conferences. Everyone is saying, oh, it's overhyped, it's far too expensive, blah, 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 blah. It is today, but it might not be in 20 years' time. In fact, it darn well ought not to be in 20 years' time. So how can we encourage people in their thinking to think in temporal time frames that actually take account of lots of underlying changes, right? And again, I use this example of the fiber optic cable is enabling of some things that we would never have imagined. Nobody at the dot-com era would have said, we're going to have Gen AI, and, you know, we're going to be building data centers and we're going to be passing so much data around. Like, that would have felt crazy. So again, we won't see the future, but we need to at least entertain that other things will change in systematic ways. And anyone who's been doing scenarios or that kind of thing in the world of decarbonization knows this. But I'm shocked at how little it's brought into conversations when people are focusing on a single technology. They don't look across the spectrum and say, what would it take for it to be true for our assumptions about this technology trajectory to actually come into being, and what else is going to go on that will mean that it could be truer than true or less true than true. Okay, just a couple more things. I said that, then this notion of communicating credibly and sort of thinking about the risks and interdependence, not just the hype around any technology. That's fairly obvious that that's a good way to deal with things when they're uncertain. But again, we tend not to. It tends to be all or nothing. And as I mentioned, that involves credible communication, and involves also a sort of accountability for what might happen. And then, not a surprise to any organizational scholars out there, but again, just the importance of being alert to weak signals and not dismissing them. So, is hydrogen crazy? Maybe, but is it there? Yes. And those who are investing in it, I've spoken to folks in Australia who are literally prospecting for hydrogen underground because there are known reserves. The oil and gas industry has actually known about reserves there. By the way, it's a different kind of rock from oil and gas, but and the mining industry has known about it. and people are sitting on potentially very, very lucrative reserves of hydrogen. But the most important thing that the woman I spoke to a year ago said is we need to make sure that we really understand what the reserve is, that people don't get all overhyped about this, that they understand what the constraints are, what the limits are, that it might be a local solution providing on-site energy to some of the local mining companies. We're not going to start shipping it around the world, you know, and by the way, we're geologists, we still need to prove our reserves. So look at the weak signals, but also lean into the expertise of those who actually know the risks. So those folks who have high uncertainty, they have high uncertainty because they're using all of the information they have available and recognizing all of the things that I show on this slide, that it's going to take time. It's going to, there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's my message. Again, it's for a more general audience. Would love to just stop right now and get your feedback. And I think it's wonderful to have all these links in the chat. Whenever I open the chat, it's making an enormous thing here. So I'm just going to close it now so I can see you. I'm also going to close my slides so I can see you better. And just welcome any questions or conversation anyone has. Thank you. Any questions, observations? I do like the hand clapping, so that's good. Yeah, Tobias.
Well, thanks a lot. Very, very inspiring and reminding us of those different dynamics. Two things come to my mind. What about cases where the actual trend has outpaced the expectations? So if you look at China and the scaling up of solar and wind there, all the predictions have fallen short of what actually happened, right? I think that's a very interesting angle to look at it as well, because it can go the other way as well in favor of the decarbonization. And it'd really be interesting to learn more about those drivers there. And the other thing is probably the hype for me is the flip side of stigma as well. And a lot of these technologies come with a stigma. For instance, you mentioned the Hindenburg. It comes with the stigma of a major disaster. If you look at what's happening in politics, not only with Trump, also conservative politics in Germany, for instance, they try to stigmatize the heat pump, for instance, right? So there seems to be counter movements against the hype. And a complete picture may need to look into the stigma side as well.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you on both. You're absolutely right that that the solar, you know, one of the challenges with this book is it's like a complete moving target. So the more historical examples I have, the better, frankly. And I think just recognizing that has so outpaced everyone's expectations. Now I might then have to get into how do you do that and you know, without a centralized economy, because but I see it, you know, playing out on so many other fronts.
Yeah, you have it in Texas as well with wind, right?
Wind
in Texas, it's not centralized economy, and it's not the usual suspects to go for clean energy, right? I mean, if you look at the levelized cost of electricity, how that came down.
No, I think that's wonderful. And I also think that the stigma piece, right? Because it's never about just feeding the hype. There's a counter narrative on some of these things, especially right now. So, okay, that's great. Thank you. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Yes, Ivanka.
So thanks for the fascinating talk. So many interesting examples. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting, and I think it would be worth to unpack in the book, is this interplay of the social expectation setting, the ideological component that sort of underpins that, alongside with the technology aspects of it, because I think that's what makes green innovations and technology so specific, right? We had hypes around technologies like for ages, at least going back to the early or mid 20th century. So, but here we have this new new interplay. And then it all happens in this globalized world with the social media pumping this up. So I think that interplay of those three things is quite interesting. I don't know how you think about that. I left in the comments the Bill Gates recent notes where he basically he dumps down the expectations about how much we need to invest in green technologies. So yeah, that's
no, that's brilliant. I haven't I've been following all of this, and I think I think relates to Tobias's point about stigma too, right? So if the vision, I mean, I don't know if you know Vaclav Smil's work. He's apparently one of Bill Gates's favorite authors, or at least when Bill Gates believed in all things climate.
I know.
And Vaclav Smil has dozens of books, but one of them talks about technologies we're still waiting for in one of his chapters, and he talks about these sort of the hyperloop transportation and whatnot. And so some of these visions of the future are simply just visions of the future. And obviously they all carry social and environmental implications, but they haven't necessarily been thought of that way. They've just been thought of as, oh, how quaint, we didn't do that. But I think what both of you are saying is there's and I haven't articulated as well as I need to. And so this is super helpful that there's so much at stake, right? And that therefore that means that we get the manipulation of meaning and expectation around these technologies that we might not in another way. And I've just been told my battery's running out, so I'm going to plug in here. And Maha, since you're recording it, I'm going to worry less about taking notes and more about listening. So Daniel, that said, I'm going to grab my notebook because I can't quite imagine not having it. Sorry, I'm just sitting on the floor where I can plug my computer in. Go ahead, Daniel.
No, just building on this comment from Ivanka about Bill Gates. I wasn't clear how much you would want to go into the individual level and the responsibilities of individuals in intentionally or not overselling certain trends and hypes and all of this. There's a level here of in a way just bad behavior and self-interested bad behavior on the part of individuals. I don't know if you want to take that angle, but there is certainly that's something that came to mind in some of these things. And thanks very much for the talk and the examples. It was great.
Thank you. I think just really briefly on that, because it's relating conceptually to in the literature there is this concept, and Grimes and Logue use it in their work on material proof and social proof. And so, in the absence of a physical, we've all seen the airship take off and land, and we're going to buy the ticket next week. We rely extensively on, quote, social proof. And then, as you've all been observing, in today's society, we really listen to certain voices, right? And that's always been the case. But certain voices are privileged. Certain voices have a lot more power. And I think the Bill Gates thing actually might make a very nice example on that front. And I'm not quite sure how we avoid that. But anyway, but a lot of what I'm trying to do is just sort of lay out the truths of how these things work, which may seem obvious, but I keep learning as I go. Maha, go ahead.
I suppose my question is probably a little bit more from an information systems angle. And my knowledge of sustainability or its literature is very limited. I mean, really limited. So please disregard if this isn't useful. But when I look at the world of software, and in software often builds projects or programs in a way that they are modular. So I'm thinking of your understanding of expectations and how expectations are sometimes managed because of the software, the systems that are already out there, and how there are interdependencies between them, which manage to sort of nudge these technologies in particular directions as well, if that even happens in the more hardware form as well.
I think, no, that's great. And anyone else from the IS side, because there's a whole layer in sustainability conversations right now about AI. Is AI the problem or enabling? And the answer is yes. Briefly, and I'm not an expert at all in that, but I think if I understand correctly, so the point is, you know, we know from hardware and software that there are legacies and interdependencies, and there are things that you can develop as sort of transformational, but they're going to have to rely on what's already there. And actually, you've anticipated future chapters of this book, which is, you know, one of my key arguments is it's not about what the technology is. So in this chapter, I'm not trying to say, let's bet on the one that we know that wins, because many will win, many must win, and most of these actually have to win. And they won't win in the same way in the same places, because it really is the when, where, and how about the technology. It's not the what. So the facticity of having hydrogen available, if you have no other grid interconnection, if you don't have industry, if you don't, you know, and you happen to have it lying beneath the ground, go for it. Fantastic, right? Everywhere else, we've got legacy infrastructure, and that's not just physical, you know, connections, interconnections, and power plants and whatnot. It's also legacy policy, legacy cultural commitment to we do or don't fund this, or we do or don't like, you know, having privately developed this or that or the other. So I'm not sure there's a software hardware analogy there, but there's definitely interdependencies that matter. And I'm wondering whether also what you're saying, or you know, that there are really interesting ways that we can work with existing quote hardware and create novel approaches even with that as a potential constraint. And so if that's what you're asking, let me try this, because there's stuff I've heard about, again, on this sort of podcast scale, about you know, everyone's super concerned right now that our grids everywhere are completely on their knees. So they're old, they're not performing that well, and we're overtaxing them. And so I can build you wind and solar. Solar is the cheapest form of energy, electricity generation anywhere on the planet right now. I cannot connect it at the grid scale in most places, or at least I've got a long wait to do so. And yet I'm learning now there are various technologies where we're taking the same transmission lines, and we're enhancing somehow through something, probably digital technology, how we actually transmit over them. So maybe that's a sort of like software can help us with old hardware kind of problem, or at least in a transitional way. I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone, or to you, Maha, as an analogy.
No, it does. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else, especially the IS folks, because I'm curious to know, what would you do in my shoes differently? Or the same?
Believe it or not, there are probably fewer IS people here than the sustainable, which is why you've got amazing people.
Okay, good.
From sustainable.
Good. Okay.
I'm not IS, but I would have a question.
Yeah.
Hey, Jennifer, wonderful talk.
Hi.
Also really great how you built the story and took us on the journey. So that I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether, to what extent you think expectations are also influenced by sort of the perceived sophistication or newness of a technology. I say that because I've recently challenged my business analytics students, to whom I teach sustainability, with a text on a very basic technology being put to very good use in the Sahel zone, and it the comments that they make on that technology makes me think that there is this pull to the more sophisticated language model and the more sophisticated this and that, and the more sophisticated and complex and hard to understand technology, the more it's hyped.
Yeah.
Information can often come from mature technologies or simple technologies used in novel ways in new contexts. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, Maha, I really appreciate, or Maya, Maya?
Maya,
Yeah,
yes.
sorry. I really appreciate that comment. It reminds me of a story I'm gonna share very briefly, but and I think this is the problem, right? Is by definition, hype is about the shiny new. It's about the unknown. It's about the vision of the future. And if we've got something that is tried and true, it's just, you know, even before social media, it just wasn't interesting until it is, right? Sometimes on social media, they can make crazy stuff look cool. So when I was in Singapore, I was part of a bunch of activity going on, including there were some sessions in a panel from the apparel industry. And having been a context I've studied in the past, I sat in, I was really interested to see a lot of it was industry people. And so the headline there is when you look at the value chain emissions of clothing, textiles, things that we wear, about 55% of the carbon impact comes from the manufacturing phase. Not particularly surprising, right? Because distribution and raw materials and all of that would be a smaller proportion. Of that 55% of the overall impact associated with apparel, within manufacturing, 80% is, quote, thermal energy, i.e. heat, boilers, right? Because you need steam and you need heat for processes. And furthermore, we were in Southeast Asia with a lot of experts who are literally on the ground in Southeast Asia in these manufacturing facilities. As we likely know, the great majority of manufacturing occurs in smaller facilities, right? And most of those get their heat from coal boilers. And literally, I spoke to someone who works for one of the brands, and he says, yes, I have seen them. It conjure up in your head an image of Victorian era England and a man standing there, and it is mostly a man loading coal in with a shovel to the boiler. That because the boiler produces the heat and the steam, and you know they're off grid by definition. And I thought, you know, if I was shocked, and I thought if only people knew that it doesn't need to be any sexier, pardon my language, than getting rid of your coal-fired boilers. In fact, that is the work associated with decarbonizing the apparel industry. And we all care about fast fashion, and we all, you know, and we might want to do the latest app and the latest this and the latest the other. And, you know, it's like, how do we get a bunch of people who have boilers to, quote, electrify when there might not be grid electricity, and when it's expensive, and when coal is there, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I that's my story, but I think that is something I need to bring out in this, which is we dismiss, and in that case, you know, there are people literally going around introducing very known technologies, but the expertise that they need to know in order to say this is what you need and this is how we'll do it in this particular case in your plant, because they're not all the same, is still deep. And I think we dismiss that to our peril probably in tackling some of these hard problems. So so tell your students, you know, we're still a coal economy in many parts of the world. We like to think that solar and wind are here to stay, but this is a big beast. We're transitioning, and we need to engage with all of the technologies, high tech, low tech, and everything in between. So thank you. Great. You guys are amazing. It's been, you know, at first I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is so different. And I don't know if I have anything intellectual or academic to say, but I certainly benefited hugely from your comments, from your attention. And as you can tell, this is all just a big experiment of me trying to write something a little differently. And it just gives me, you know, sometimes I doubt myself, because while it's really hard to write journal publications, at least I've spent my entire career doing it. But I really believe in what I'm trying to do, and you've given me tons of food for thought and kind of just some assurance that hopefully the message will resonate. So really appreciate it, and thank you, Maha, for trusting me to come along and say something.
It's been a privilege, seriously. Thank you so much. It was amazingly interesting. And as I said, I'm not a sustainability expert, so I can't imagine the majority of the audience here. So thank you very, very much. The recording will be made available. They just usually edit it and clean it up a little, the front and the end. And then I will definitely send you a link for that.
Wonderful.
So thank
and
you
I'm going
so
to try
much.
to if you know how to save the chat after all these years on Zoom, I'm still hopeless at that. If you can save the chat, because all of these
I've never
great
done
links
that, but
and
I'm just going to
suggestions.
do a really crude copy and paste, if that helps.
Okay, fantastic. And anyone, if you want to reach out separately, would love to hear from you with further thoughts. But really appreciate your time today. And thank you.